All right, so this is essentially a ritual writing workshop, but what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about tonight is actually ritual structure. When you get down to ritual writing in general, there's a lot of art that goes into the liturgy and the poetry and things like that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But if you really have a good grasp of ritual structure and how rituals sort of work, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of build upon that skeleton. Just like, we all look very different, but beneath the skin, we all have, very similar skeletons. So we're going to talk about that skeleton tonight. So some of you may or may not know me or much about me, but I am the current Archdruid of Fire. I am an AODA Druid adept. My adept project related to performing sigil magic within our Solitary Grove ritual that we have for AODA. I'm also a bishop in the Gnostic Celtic Church and the current preceptor. I'm also a dedicant of Arneocht Fane. I'm in their clergy training programs, their initiate training program, and the liturgist and the magicians guilds there. I'm a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, a member of the Druidical Order of the Golden Dawn. I'm in the Universal Gnostic Church Seminary. And from all those things, I guess you could say that I'm basically a ritual enthusiast. In addition to all the various traditions that I've been a part of, I've dabbled with some other rituals, including Wicca, which is where I first started kind of my magic pagan journey. And then also just I study rituals and grimoires uh, for magical rituals that I would never actually do and that don't meet my cosmology or my theology at all. But I just find ritual as a whole to be fascinating. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the things that I've kind of gleaned from that just over the years. Primarily in terms of my practice, since everybody in AODA has a very different practice from one another. My practice is very magico-religious, heavy on occultism, especially like academic study of occultism. So that colors a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight. I will say that I'm primarily versed in Western occultism, Western ritual. So there may be deviations from this in other cultures that I'm not as entirely familiar with. I'm starting to learn more about those every day, but in the meantime, I'm happy to share with you the stuff that I picked up so far. So what is a ritual really? Um, we often think of rituals as being these things that we do for initiation or that we do for the seasons or to perform magic, but it's really a lot more general than that. There's a lot of things that can be considered rituals, and when we think of things as being like these high magic rituals, it can make them seem very intimidating and very like unapproachable, especially if you're newer into your journey and you haven't been exposed to a lot of the trials and tribulations that various like very famous magicians have dealt with. But when we get down to it, I like to use this quote from Dion Fortune to kind of describe ritual. Dion Fortune said that magic is the science and art of causing changes in consciousness in conformity with will. Now, I know that that says magic, but we could easily include ritual in this. The quote down there below that is from a much less famous person, me, and it says that if magic is the science or art, then ritual is the scalpel and the paintbrush. Ritual is the tool that we use in order to create changes in our consciousness, in order to better reflect the changes that we want to make in our own lives, the things that we want to impact our own lives. And that can look like a lot of different things. If we look at various types of rituals, you'll see that we have our magical rituals in there with the ceremonial magic and the practical magic, the high and low magic, so to speak. And we'll see those religious experiences that we have in GCC and that we maybe experienced in other, in like the religion of our childhood or the religion that we still have. But there's also a lot of things that are really rituals that we don't really even think of as being magic anymore, but they really are kind of rooted in that same idea. if you think of in terms of weddings and graduations, if you think of sports, like I live not that far from Kansas City, so right now we're, in the throes of Super Bowl season, and everybody has their superstitions and their things that they're doing to try to encourage the Chiefs to win in their own ways, I guess. And most of these people would never consider these to be acts of magic, but that when we get down to it, they are trying to change their own consciousness in a way that aligns with success, with having a successful marriage, with moving on to the next stage of their life in terms of graduation or a coming of age thing, or victory in terms of sports. And when you get down to it, a lot of these rituals, no matter whether it's spring cleaning in your garage, or sitting down to watch the Super Bowl, or having an elaborate rite to raise your consciousness, raise the vibrations of your soul and things like that, they all have essentially a very similar structure. And the way that I've broken this down is essentially that we have procession, purpose, creating space, the working, and then the conclusion. So within procession, I actually include anything that you would do prior to the ritual. So anything related to that ritual that you're performing before you essentially start your walk into the area. And the reason I include all that is because I think that procession is actually a really important part of ritual and getting into that ritual mindset. And for some of us, we don't have a very long walk. For me, to go into the appropriate gate for the AODA rituals, it's basically 2 steps from the entrance of the room that I often do them in. So I don't have a long period of time to really to really get into that mindset. So instead, I'll start getting into that mindset while I'm gathering my tools together, while I'm making incense, or while I'm getting, the music together or putting on my robes. All of that is part of that procession before I get into the space. Once I'm in that space, and once you're in that space, then you start looking at the purpose of the ritual. Why are you here? What is it that you want to accomplish with this ritual? What changes do you want to make? And that's a much more complicated thing than people often think of it being. If you read a lot about intent and magic and things like that, which we'll talk a little bit about later, having a well-developed purpose can be really fantastic. And then sometimes you'll just have a standard purpose, such as we often have in some of our set ritual scripts. Then when we talk about creating space, we're connecting to that sacred center. We're creating a space that we can essentially work within, that we can affect our consciousness, that we can affect hidden realms, that we can really make changes within. And there's a lot of different ways that we go about that. Various forms of purification, consecration, and what we would often refer to as cosmological recreation. Often the things that we use, such as fire and water, for example, in our purification practices, are also things that are mythologically linked to the creation of the universe, right? Like the creation of the universe through the interactions of fire and water, or the interactions of the elements, and various things like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. And then once we've created that space, once we've connected to that switchboard in which we can operate, that we can make all these changes, that's when we get into whatever the work of our ritual is. And that can be a lot of different things, from just celebrating a season, offering devotion to a specific deity, performing any kind of acts of magic, or even just meditation, or sitting within that space and just being contemplative. And then at the conclusion of the ritual, we essentially have a confirmation, a reaffirmation that we have completed the thing that we set out to do. And then we kind of undo all the things we've done to make this space, to make this rite sort of magical in its own way. It's a return to the mundane, so to speak. Whenever I say mundane, I always say it with kind of like air quotes around it, because My approach to, I guess, life and to ritual in general is that very few things are actually mundane. You know, if you think in terms of like in the Gnostic Celtic Church, we talk about the doctrine of one, that all things are connected and essentially all things are divine. And in that case, all things uh, are essentially magic as well. So uh, if you think in terms of graduation, um, with a procession, with our preparation, we've all seen the graduates walk into uh, walk into the commencement ceremony. They'll pass, through the audience, they'll pass the band up on the stage or into their seats. And that is part of that procession into that area that's part of that graduation ritual. And we see a very similar concept with the bride that walks the aisle for the wedding. You carrying all of the things you need to clean your garage to the garage. You know, you're preparing for that action, for that thing that's going to uh, kind of like change your outlook on life in some way. Or as I was talking about, since we're coming up on the Chiefs 49ers Super Bowl, you prepare all your snacks, you have all the pregame stuff playing on the television, and you proceed in there, you lay everything out. All of that is that preparation. So really, that's not all that different than what we see whenever we're talking about magical ritual and we're talking about druidic ritual. In AODA, we have a specific gate that we enter through for each of our grades. Um, in some traditions, whenever you proceed to the ritual site, there will be certain patterns that you proceed in. In the early days of Arniacht Fane, for example, they would actually proceed in and sort of recreate what Isaac Bonewitz called the Druid sigil, which some people may have seen before in other places. It's a circle with two lines essentially across it, kind of parallel lines. And you'll also see like spiral patterns into the center, or going in and with in order of your grades or things like that. And that's all to help kind of break that mundane mindset and set this off as being something different from the average world that you've always been a part of. And that, as I mentioned, I include making my incense, dressing in my robes, decorating my altar, gathering together the oils and the tinctures and things like that I might use for my ritual. Um, there's Whenever we talk about the word sacred and the word sacrifice, a lot of people don't realize that those actually relate to the idea of something being cut off from the world. So when we're talking about something being sacred, we're essentially making it cut off from mundane reality in some way. We're honoring the fact that we've essentially that we've changed that mindset. So then whenever we move on to our purpose, that's whenever we have that moment of we've gathered our breath. I always take a few breaths and kind of center myself. I've prepared myself in the proper mindset. I try to get into that kind of middle trance state. And then that's whenever we say exactly what we're here to do. And you've been hearing these things your entire life, as I have on the page there. We have gathered here on this day to join these two in holy matrimony, right? Is that like a ritual purpose or what, right? We come together to celebrate the life of, so and so for a funeral rite. And the one that I see every year as a person who works for the University of Kansas, the commencement of the University of Kansas is now in session. Now, none of these people are thinking of this in terms of a magical ritual, but what we are essentially doing is setting all these kids down, and we've cut them off from their daily life to show them that they are for essentially what amounts to an initiation rite. So in AODA, we have the beginning of almost all of our rituals of the solitary grove variety with "Let the powers be attentive, as I am about to open a grove of druids in this place." In GCC, we have "I now invoke the mystery of communion, that common unity which unites all beings throughout the world. and et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go on with it too long because that's not what we're here for. Or the one that I just did on this day of Imbolc, I honor Bridget of the Holy Well and of the Sacred Hearth. On each of these, where I'm essentially saying what the goal is of my ritual, what it is that we're here to do, and I may have other purposes and other intents, other things like this throughout the ritual. But at each stage, I'm essentially speaking out into existence what I'm wanting my mind to understand of the reason that I'm doing these things. So when you're writing your purpose, make sure to be specific. State what you want to do, and this is especially important in group ritual because we need to start getting everybody on the same page. In Arnuacht Fane is really developed as a group ritual centric church. And one of the things that they often talk about in their various training programs is what we call establishing the group mind. And that's essentially getting everybody to thinking about the same symbolism, to get them thinking about on kind of the same goal, on the same level. And the first step of that is really to share a purpose, to share an idea of what it is we're here to accomplish, so that we're all focused essentially on the same thing. If you're doing a ritual for practical magic, then you really want to get your intent nailed down, because a poor intent in magic can actually result in you getting exactly the opposite of what you want. It can be a little bit tricky, but there's a lot of information about that in the Druid Magic Handbook. If you want to look at something that's kind of very, very fits very well with the AODA ritual system, fits with the Spear of Protection, and I'll have some more resources for those types of systems later here in the at the end of the presentation here. And you can also see some more examples of seasonal rituals, especially in the Druidry handbook. There's one for each of the high days. None of these things are dogma. None of them are things you have to do. But as I said, I read rituals from all sorts of different traditions, and a lot of that is just to get ideas, to kind of see what people are doing, what they say has worked, and what might work for me. So when we move to creating space, that's when we start getting into what we'd consider probably the more magical work of the rituals. But when we create sacred space, the idea is that we're essentially connecting to all sacred spaces that have ever existed before, at least within that tradition. Some would say period. So if you think of the Spear of Protection, which is like our core practice in AODA, part of the reason we have a shared practice is because every time you do the Spear of Protection, you're connecting to every time that I've done the Spear of Protection, that anyone's done the Spear of Protection, back to Juliet Ashley and John Gilbert and all these people that came before us. And similarly, whenever we create sacred time, we're connecting to all sacred times. We're wanting to be in the center, in the switchboard, I always call it, where we essentially have access to the cosmos, right? And as we continue to grow as an order, as we continue to grow as a tradition and share some of these elements with others, we tend to build power over time. And it's just a matter of whether of building our own abilities to be able to access that power on an individual level. In the book, The Sacred and Profane, there's a nice quote about this, or a couple of them actually, but one is that a universe comes to birth from its center, and that sacred time is indefinitely recoverable, indefinitely repeatable. So there is no, this is not a finite resource. Every time we do a ritual, we are essentially rebirthing the universe. We are re-beginning everything. There's no shortage of sacred time to where if I'm using it, that you can't use it. We'll all be using it for the entire existence of humanity. We look at some ideas of creating space. If you look at the mundane and we talk about those graduates again, they're wearing robes that, quite frankly, are very similar to what we would wear. I've got two master's robes that have sleeves like crescent moons, right? And there's a reason for that. All these things are very directly symbols. At the University of Kansas, all of our graduates walk through the campanules while bells play. One of the most common ways to purify a large group of people outside of like aspersion with water is what we call sound cleansing, and that's often done through bells. So they're walking through these sound waves, these vibrations. They're essentially being cleansed as they move through their procession down to their ritual space, for lack of better terms. Similarly, we could see that with the rose petals you often see at weddings, where we're putting these out before the bride walks in, before the ritual starts. Or my coworker Judd, uh, who's he's a huge Chiefs fan, and he has his lucky chair, his lucky jersey, drinks the same beer as the last Super Bowl that they won. This year he's even added Taylor Swift because he's decided that that's probably going to be lucky. So he's going to be listening to a lot of Taylor Swift up to the game while he gets all of his stuff ready. And in magical practices, we see things like calling the quarters, which you'll see in Wicca and in witchcraft, but is also linked to originates really with the Golden Dawn and some of their systems that were very influential upon Wicca and various other systems as well, including AODA for that matter. Within ADF, you'll see the purification using the water and the fire, and then also the essentially giving offerings to the fire, the well, and the tree, which is essentially the ADF cosmology of the world. And then with the Druidical Order of the Golden Dawn, we have purification and consecration with fire and water as well, but in a different way, using the Awen as a symbol and going into those different quarters. And then the one that kind of surprised me when I realized it was that when I was a young person in the Methodist Church before finding all this paganism stuff, I used to be one of the candle lighters, and they would put me in a white robe, and I would literally walk a flame on a candle into the church where I would light candles on the altar, essentially bringing light into this space. And if you think in terms of cosmology in the Christian cosmology, one of the first things is let there be light, right? So essentially, I'm reenacting this. And we see that same thing with, as I mentioned, with ADF, with the Indo-European fire and water and the world tree. And then also with an AODA, whenever we start setting everything up and we're bringing in all of the elements, we're bringing in the various spirits of above, below, and within. Those are essentially pieces of our cosmology. So as part of creating sacred space, I want to try to overwhelm my senses, and in order to allow myself to be opened up to new sensations that I might not feel otherwise. This is the reason that you'll see within a lot of rituals, you'll see candles, because the flame essentially stimulates your eyes. You'll see incense because of the smell. You'll have music or bells, or you'll be wearing specific robes because there will be a different feeling to it, a different sensation. You may have specific ritual things that you eat and drink if you are in a tradition that uses it, like cakes and ale, or in my case, I often use a certain brand of Irish whiskey that I rarely use for anything else. So when I taste it, that's part of essentially being sacred, of breaking myself off from mundane life. Um, we'll talk in a little bit about accommodations for some of these, but if you've ever wondered why there's so much going on in rituals, a lot of that, I believe, is to kind of like overwhelm the physical senses that want to make you think with logic, that want to make you address things from essentially almost like your Freudian ego, and instead get down to the things in your subconscious so we can make changes there. So in AODA, we create space in a couple of different ways. One is through circumambulation. We take each of the elements around the perimeter of the space. We call it purification of that space. And we're essentially pulling in each of the elements energetically into the tools that we have on the altar that are symbols of these energies, and then creating a barrier around our area and cleansing it from outside in. And then we will say essentially the universal Druid prayer, which invokes our spirit allies, and it charges the place through those Awen chants. If you've ever been in a group ritual where everybody's doing the Awen, it can be a very powerful thing. There's a lot of vibration there. You feel really kind of connected with everyone and with everything. A little trick on the Awen, if you're doing it especially by yourself, that I always tell people: when you do your Awens, try to drop the vibration as low as you can into your solar plexus. It takes a little practice, but if you think of how you have head voice, you have chest voice, you have a mix when we talk about like vocal performance, you could also take those vibrations into other parts of your body. So if you imagine dropping that vibration down into your solar plexus, you'll feel it start radiating out throughout your entire body. And to me, that's what a great sensation for beginning a ritual. And then we also do the spear of protection, and that's really centering ourselves in the cosmos, drawing upon the elements, the telluric and solar currents. And if you think in terms of our symbology, you're now in the center of each direction, you're in the center of each element, and you're also in the center of each season. So you're centered between space and time. And essentially, what we've achieved by creating this sacred space within our tradition is that we are accessing the power of creation, that lunar current, that Nuivra, the Awen. We have access. We are in all space. We are in all time, and we are a part of all things. And if you can really kind of like hammer that home with yourself, you'll really get that sense of unification, of oneness that really all mystic traditions sort of seek. So then we get to the working. And the working can be very simple. It can be very complicated depending on what kind of ritual you're doing. As I mentioned, sometimes you just set up the space and you meditate within it. And in fact, that's one of the best ways to learn the ritual openings and closings initially. But the working itself is that thing that we're trying to change, that thing that our consciousness that we're trying to program. And in mundane life, that's when we start seeing the presentation of the candidates for the degrees, the exchange of the rings at the wedding ceremony, or the watching of the Super Bowl, which I'll be doing this Sunday. Um, and then in magic and in religion, that's when we start burning our sigils. We celebrate the season. In GCC, we do communion. And this is also when you would make your offerings in a devotional rite, because now you have access to essentially this, to the spiritual realm, more of a direct access to the beings that you may be giving offerings to. So when you're designing the work, it's important to really base it around symbol, metaphor, and myth. We're trying to speak directly to your subconscious because that's how we're going to create change in your consciousness. You're affected a lot more by your subconscious than a lot of people realize. And one of the benefits of Druidry, one of the benefits of magic that people often find is that their perspective changes on some things, that they feel more balanced, they feel more in place. And that's really one of the benefits of ritual in general. Even if you think of just your daily ritual, right? Like, I get up in the morning, I make coffee, I put on some music, I read, and then I start getting into my actual, like, I guess what we would normally think of as rituals. But all those things that I did prior to that are just as much of a ritual and just as important as the SOP, the Qigong that I do, the 5 Tibetan rites, all this other stuff that I'll eventually get to in my morning. If I don't get that coffee and I don't get that reading and I don't get that music first thing in the morning and I get rushed through it, it throws my entire day out of whack. And chances are you have something like that as well, that if you don't get to go through your normal routine, then your day kind of like just isn't as good, or you just don't feel as in balance. And that's just how dependent we are upon these little rituals in life. If and if we look at the AODA and GCC, then we have a lot of symbol sets. You know, each of the elements itself is a symbol that stands for a lot of different things. They stand for different emotions. They stand for different traits. That in addition to being the the elements of nature themselves. In GCC, when we talk about the bread and the wine, we're actually talking about the telluric current and the solar current. We have water and wine that you could also see as being essentially the white and red dragon currents that we would often work with within the Dolmen Arch or within the Druid Magic Handbook. Some of you may not be entirely familiar with those because they're more advanced things that that aren't within AODA's curriculum itself. But you could think of them in terms of essentially the the mitigation of chaos. Whenever we talk, and a lot of times occultists will talk about chaos and how chaos actually is kind of helps the powers of creation in terms of keeping life subtle and keeping creation happening. Where form can become stagnant, injecting chaos into it can become uh, can create stability essentially. It comes from the white and red dragons come from a Merlin myth where there were a white and a red dragon that were in clay pots below the castle, and it was shaking the castle, crumbling it. But when the dragons were released, they were essentially fighting each other and were essentially balanced out. So it's important to get to know your symbol sets within your traditions or within the different things that you're going to use. And there's several different ways to get to know a symbol set. One is just research. You know, whenever we talk about traditions with shared symbol sets, um, that shared use, as I mentioned, gives them power over time, and we see that with runes, with Enochian sigils, with the Om, and various other things like that, where there may be some small deviations in terms of symbols meanings, but the overall it stays pretty much the same over time. And some symbols are really based upon archetypes. When we look a lot of the Neoplatonic elemental use, things like that, that's why we see a lot of the same directions, the same attributions for these different elements throughout different traditions. Another way is to use intuition and meditation. My warning on that is you should never use intuition for anything you're burning or ingesting. There's things that are very poisonous to use as incense and then potentially inhale. And there's obviously herbs and things like that that you do not want to ingest because they can be very harmful for you. But in terms of say the attributions of colors or numbers or specific items, if you I like to hold those items and meditate on them and really kind of do discursive meditation, teasing apart their different traits. And that will essentially allow me to help build a new symbol set based on those things. If you can support that with myths and with with your cosmology for whatever kind of ritual you're doing, or you're just your personal cosmology, then you can really create something pretty cool and pretty powerful, because you can really build layers upon it. And you can really show how these things are living traditions that change over time. They're not stagnant. They're not things that are only done in the past. And then just practice. Your past ritual experiences will really help you narrow down what works for you, what doesn't. Um, you know, I have very specific instances that I like more than others. I, have very specific tools that I like more than others. And I have some that I bought, used a few times, and then they've just sat on a shelf ever since and looked pretty. But um, the important part that I always tell people that a spiritual practice, a magical practice, their practice, right? If you ever read the magical diaries of different occultists or magicians, they're full of failures, and they're full of times whenever the things they wanted to do didn't work, and that they had to learn new things. Went through massive rituals only to have to start them over because of things, and that happens to everybody. So I just never want anyone to intimidate themselves out of getting started, because all of us are just learning, and we only have one life to learn it all in. Well, and at least right now, anyway. You may have other lives depending upon your belief system. So some different ideas for things you can do in that working piece in between the opening and closing are things like candle magic, divination. I'm a big fan of black mirror scrying. I do that a lot after setting up the AODA Grove. Is sigil magic, which obviously I've done a fair amount of. I have a fairly strong chaos magic influence upon my like practical magic practice. Uh, Herbal tinctures and oils, you can make those within within your ritual. You can use them within your ritual. Various spells, like I like to take some of the spells from witchcraft that are fairly simple and do them within a larger ritual. Sometimes I think that's a lot of fun. And then just other concepts from other traditions, as long as you're being respectful of that, and as long as you're approaching the right way. Obviously, we want to avoid being disrespectful to other cultures, especially cultures that have these traditions as an important part of them. Um, we often differentiate between practical ritual and high ritual. Um, Really, practical ritual, like as I define it, is you're working towards a specific goal. High ritual is more about elevation of your intelligence to access, what people would call like your Awen, or your higher genius, holy guardian angel, whatever you want to call it in terms of those things. But in those type of rituals, you could do meditation, more divination. That's a little bit different. Scrying's a part of that as well. But also the communion ritual itself that we use in GCC, one of its goals is to make you one with all things and to help you find and follow your own Awen. Devotional rituals are really great within those. And then also you can use ceremonial magic that's meant to kind of elevate those things, such as Merlin's Wheel, which is the Mysteries of Merlin's book by John Michael Greer, which I'll have that at the end of this as well. When we get to the conclusion of the ritual, that's when we start breaking everything apart and kind of reestablishing ourselves within the flow of our daily life of everything that's our normal existence, I guess. So we release the elements, we extinguish all of our candles. Always say thank you to the spirits or the powers that you invoke. It's just a polite thing to do. I'm a big person in terms of hospitality, reciprocity, things like that. It plays a big part in my practice. So I'm definitely big about thank yous. Dispose of the offerings properly and with due reverence. And we essentially reestablish the mundane. It goes from being a temple to being, my basement guest room or my office, right? Um, and then we will confirm verbally as well as symbolically and just mentally, I guess, that the work is done, that the ritual is over. In some traditions, that is just a matter of saying this rite has now ended, as well as picking up all of your stuff. So some conclusions that we'll commonly see, like in terms of a wedding, you will see, by the power invested in me, I pronounce you man and wife, right? That is a conclusion. They're affirming that this ritual of ring sharing, that they've essentially magical ritual of connecting two people, that it's been successful. And a funeral, we commit their body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There's a reason that that's said in so many different funerals, because that is confirmation of the success of that rite. And then graduation, which I have 6 degrees, which is probably why I use graduation so much, but we confer you upon you the degrees of whatever. These students have now been initiated. They are now have the privileges, the responsibilities of essentially their grade, right? Just like you would go through your initiation in AODA. Speaking of AODA, we have at the end of our solitary ritual a invocation of Excalibur and a pledge of service to the earth, as well as the another Awen, because we love those things in Druidry. In ADF, it's common to have a blessing that begins with something along the lines of "Go now, children of Earth," and carry this blessing out into the world, or things like that. Um, Whenever I was a young Methodist, there was the benediction at the end of the church service was always one of my favorite parts, because that's where they tended to get kind of poetic. And then, as I mentioned, like sometimes it's pretty simple. In the Druidic Order of the Golden Dawn, the last thing you say is, "This temple is now closed," and that's it. Almost like you've kicked everybody out of the bar at the end of the night. So, looking at some common how these play out in 3 different Druid orders, I specifically used orders that have structures that are publicly available in books. Um, for example, so some of them I don't have in there. So, like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids is an initiatory order. I haven't found the bare bones ritual structure in any book that was released by OBOD. So I don't want to risk sharing anything that shouldn't be shared as a member of the order. On the other hand, ADF, the Druidic Order, the Golden Dawn, Henge of Keltria, um, and us as well have ritual structures that are very easy to find online, or to find within books that are published by people within those orders. And we can kind of see how all these things that we've talked about play out in each of these. For those who may not be familiar with the Henge of Keltria, it's actually it was an sort of a schism off of ADF at one point. It no longer exists, but it was more focused upon magic, a narrower pantheon of deities than ADF often works within. So that's why you'll see some commonalities between the two. So what I wanted to have up here are 2 that are essentially neo-Druid. So um, they don't involve like the directions and things like that, like you would see in AODA or the Druidic Order of the Golden Dawn, that are relying more upon like those Golden Dawn type systems. So, looking at Arniacht Fane, um, you'll see Procession, which is obviously the Procession. And then whenever we get into creating space, it's really a not as complicated as it looks whenever you list it all out. But there are several steps to it, including the purification. ADF is really built on that idea of reciprocity, on hospitality. So the way that they create space and the way that they hold space, instead of having a barrier, is to essentially give offerings to friendly spirits will help you with the rite. So that starts with the Earth Mother, because all the rites will start with the Earth, start and end with the Earth Mother in ADF. Um, and then that also includes a gatekeeper who essentially assists the druid with the opening of the gates, that's done magically, and kind of protects the druid from any negative influences, I guess. So all that middle stuff up to essentially the opening of up to the kindred and the kindred prayers and offerings is just the establishing of that sacred space. The working for ADF are those prayers to the different spirits, the ancestors, the nature spirits, and the deities, and then offerings to them, followed by an omen to see if those were received, and then receiving essentially uh, receiving their blessings in the form of like ritual ingestion of some sort of liquid generally. They do have a working aspect after that. Sometimes you'll see something in group rituals where, especially healing Healing spells or prayers to certain people is really common. But most of the working section of an ADF ritual is that reciprocity and that blessing aspect. And then they get to the conclusion, which essentially undoes every one of those steps, which makes it seem really unwieldy, but once you get it down, it's pretty simple. Within Keltria, you have the same type of like heavy establishing of sacred space with the marking and the prayers, the parting of the veil, up until you start getting into those same basic workings that ADF has with the invocations and the offerings. Within DODG, or DOGD, sorry, they actually use the rituals of the pentagram for the creation of sacred space and for the holding of that. So you're using magic as a way of holding that space versus a relationship with a deity. You'll see similar circumambulation to what you would see in AODA with the solitary opening and closing. And then the invocation is more of an invocation of the Golden Dawn. And then also a license to depart at the end, which is a kind of Golden Dawn-ish thing, essentially giving all spirits that have been trapped by that by the ritual of the pentagrams, allowing them to depart. Now, obviously, those are three different Druid orders with slightly different ritual structures than we would have here. But ours really isn't all that different. So within AODA, whenever we have our procession, you put on all your ritual garb, you proceed through the gate of your grade. If you're out in nature somewhere, or you're being a part of a group ritual, then that may be a fairly long procession. If you're me and you're doing it in your guest bedroom, then you're processing about 2 feet once you have all your stuff together. For our purpose, we'll generally have let the powers be attentive, for I'm about to open a grove of druids in this place. And maybe if we're doing some sort of seasonal ritual, then we'll talk about that season, how the ancients saw it, things like that. Through creating space, we do the purification of the elements, the universal druid prayer, and our spirit protection. And then whenever we get into the working, that's where you can start getting really kind of creative with how you want to do things. There's the communion ritual of GCC is probably my most common thing, but I also mentioned I do a lot of scrying. Meditation is great. You can do any sort of spells, any kind of seasonal celebrations. It's really only limited to whatever your imagination is. If you just think of, if I was sitting in the center of all the cosmos, what would I want to accomplish, right? And then you kind of build it from there. And then our conclusion for AODA, we once again call the powers to attention. We state that we're releasing it. We release the elements. We send our blessing into the earth, and we do the Sword of Swords, etc. Now that I think about it, we actually have a lot longer conclusion than a lot of ritual structures has. If you're going to do group rituals, then there's some considerations that I want to make sure that people are aware of. The first is to understand the difference between accessibility and accommodation. So whenever I'm talking about in terms of this, is that with accessibility is essentially making it so anybody that wants to come to your ritual can get to it on an even basis with everybody else. That in general is a lot better than accommodation, which is finding a different way for people to essentially take part. So I try to make rituals that are accessible to everybody that I know is going to be coming, that without them having to do anything different or take a different path or anything from everybody else. They're a part of my group. They're a part of my family. I want them to be to feel like they're a part of everything. There are alternatives for incense smoke, like as much as it pains me, because I love the visual of smoke rising through the flames, but I know that it's also very tough on some people's lungs. My wife cannot be around if I use a certain brand of incense. Whatever they use for fillers really causes her to cough, and kind of her lungs to kind of feel funny. So you could always use oil burners, things like that. There's some great alternatives for the symbols of air that people have come up with in the in Discord and the forums and things like that. Solid perfumes, anything you can have that will give you a little bit of a sensation of smell would be great. But if you can't do that, you can't do that, right? That's part of making this accessible to everybody. Also, have something for people to do that they don't have to read. Some people really have a hard time reading in front of people. Not to mention there's people that have a hard time reading through because of dyslexia or just not as literate or things like that. So make sure that you have things that you can have them help with, whether that's helping with purification or different pieces of the ritual. I don't like to make people perform that don't want to perform. If you're doing purification in large groups, then you have to start looking at different ways to do it. One of the common ways that like my small group purifies is with a bowl of water. We kind of splash it on our hands, splash it on our head, our heart. But if we had 200 people, we would spend almost our entire night purifying people. What a lot of larger groups will use is like taking like sprigs of a certain type of plant and dipping it and and flicking the water on people, or sound purification, which I mentioned through like singing bowls or bells or anything like that. And then also be aware of any potential food allergies that people may have. When we do communion, we're using bread, which is often a wheat product. If you have people that are gluten sensitive, be aware of that. If you're having a feast after this ritual, which you absolutely should, it's some of the best communion stuff happens in the celebration afterwards. Make sure that you're aware of food allergies and the potential for those as well. So for the liturgy itself, the important thing is to just research like the thing that you're trying to accomplish, how other people have done it, prayers that other people have written to the same deities, or things they've written to the same purpose, that sort of thing. I like to do a lot of discursive meditation on whatever my intent is for the ritual. What are the different symbols that would mean that to me? What are some of the myths that are parallel to that? Um, Whenever I'm writing things, I'll always consider whether I want rhyme or free verse. I'm not a huge rhyme person for a solitary ritual. I'd rather do free verse myself, but rhyme tends to be a lot easier for people in a group to remember. So if you want people to be able to use the same prayers or the same liturgy ritual after ritual, you can really do that quickly if you have some simple rhymes. Um, and those can be very powerful things. The benefit of having a standard common thing that you use on every ritual is that your brain's not sitting there thinking of what the next thing to say is. It's experiencing the ritual on a different level. It's on a deeper level. You don't have to look at the script as much, although feel free to use it as much as you need to. I love my one-time rituals with my beautiful language within them. But sometimes I think I get the most out of the rituals that I don't even have to pay attention to what I'm saying anymore because it just flows off of me. It's like my mouth is saying the words, but my brain is experiencing whatever the goal of the ritual is. Um, Lean on metaphor and mythology. Those are the things that are really going to speak to your subconscious. Um, I don't think that I came up with this bottom line that a poem is a prayer on a page. I'm pretty sure I read that somewhere. Um, but whenever we look at poetry and the way it affects people that way because of metaphor and because of how that bypasses our logical mind and gets right to our sense of emotion, to our subconscious. So, some ritual resources for you if you want to get more into the Spear of Protection based rituals. There's the Druidry Handbook and the Druid Magic Handbook that both go very well with AODA's curriculum. Obviously, the Gnostic Celtic Church does if you want to have a religious dimension to your AODA practice. I'm obviously the preceptor of that and be happy to talk to people about that. We have several instructors of the Dolmen Arch, which also use the Spear of Protection, and kind of takes a different higher magic approach than what you would see in the Druid Magic Handbook. The Magic Handbook is ceremonial magic for practical purposes. There's some overlap between the two. They use some of the same techniques, but they are very different and they complement each other pretty well, to be honest. Um, I'm currently doing a lot of stuff with John Gilbert's old orders. He was one of our former Archdruids, and he was involved in a number of different esoteric groups, as many of our former Archdruids and current Archdruids, I guess, have been. But one of those is the Fellowship or the Hermetic Rose. It fits very well with the Spirit of Protection and adds a different dimension um, than you would see in some of our other stuff by bringing in the Tree of Life and the Holy Guardian Angel and some different concepts. The Way of the Golden Section kind of like focuses on sacred geometry and things like that. It can be a lot of fun, and it's a little bit different, but it also relies on the SOP. I know that Claire and I are both experimented with that. Claire is more into it than I am, I think, but I've enjoyed messing with it. The Mysteries of Merlin is like it's an initiatory thing using mythology related to Merlin that is done on each high day, and you essentially keep going around in the circle through the different levels of initiation, slowly building upon different techniques, building upon the mythology, the visualization, the magical aspects. And what's really kind of cool with it, and John Michael Greer wrote most of these books, or was involved in most of these things, since he's obviously one of our former Archdruids. But in the back of the book, he talks about how you could do this with essentially any type of mythology. And I've thought about experimenting with some of that. I'm a devotee of the Morrigan and work a lot with Irish mythology, so I would like to do something similar with Irish stuff at some point. All right, and so that's what I had to share there. I'm happy to answer any questions or receive any comments that people have. Um, Scott mentioned that liturgy is